Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining us at www.sonic-cinema.com. Before we start the third year of the Sonic Cinema podcast, I want to point you in the direction of the Sonic Cinema Patreon. It is on patreon.com. You just type in Sonic Cinema and you'll find me. Uh, those of you who pledge at the $3 and up level, the first reward for that has already been posted. Is a bit of audio outtakes from my first interview with Princeton Holt and Brian Ackley when we were talking about their film Alienated. And it's a really fun 17 minutes of audio where we're talking about blockbusters, we're talking about blockbuster movies and the way that's changed over the years, and we're talking about Batman and Superman and Star Wars and all that. And it was a really fun discussion that I've wanted to share for a while. So that is available for patrons at the $3 and more level. If you can't go that high, that's perfectly fine. The $1 level will still get you put on the Sonic Cinema mailing list, which and hopefully down the road we're going to have some more bonuses for people who even just are pledging $1. I do promise to make it worth your while. With all that being out of the way, I am ready to get started, and we are going to bring on a filmmaker who is joining the podcast for the third time, Chris Esper. The first time we discussed his work. The second time last year, we discussed Martin Scorsese's Faith trilogy, Last Temptation of Christ, Kundun, and Silence. And this year, we are doing the same thing with another filmmaker, a filmmaker that is near and dear to our hearts, the Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky. And I hope you enjoy that conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. And I've got a lot more great ideas and for episodes this coming year, and I hope you join us with that. Okay, joining me now is Chris Esper, a filmmaker who you've already heard a couple of times on the podcast over the past couple of years. This time we're doing another deep discussion into a filmmaker that we both greatly admire, the Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me again, Brian. It's always a pleasure to talk with you about film, as always.
Before we get to the topic at hand of discussing Andrei Tarkovsky, I first wanted to congratulate you for the success that you've had on the film festival circuit as far as awards received and presentations of your work for the short films you were part of in 2017. The films that you've been a part of, the Deja Vuers, Undatement Center, and
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
It's been fun to see how well those all those films, which I really admired, all three of them,
Right.
were well received over the past year. It's been great to see.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's honestly been kind of a shock for me how some of them have been as well received as they have been, particularly with the Deja Vu being such a very odd story and very odd idea. But to see it do as well as it did, yeah, it's been incredible.
So, the first place, I guess, the best place to start, I guess, this discussion, because it is a big discussion. I mean, we're basically, instead of just three specific points of a director's career like we did with Scorsese, we're
Right.
basically talking about the breadth of a career with Tarkovsky. And I was just kind of interested to go ahead and start off and ask you what your introduction to Tarkovsky was.
Well, it's very funny how my introduction to Tarkovsky was because I was in high school, and at the time, I was studying. I was doing a mentorship in puppetry, in marionettes in particular, and the folks that were teaching me about marionettes, they were also they were French and had a great love for cinema of international foreign countries, and so they were moving back to France at the end of my mentorship. Um, and they gave me a lot of things on the way out, a couple of books and, a couple other things. And one of the things that they gave me were tapes of great foreign movies, all of which I've never seen or never heard of. And I was still a very young teenager, and I still was trying to, I suppose, gain more knowledge about cinema other than just American cinema. And at that point, I was already very big Scorsese fan, but I wanted to broaden my horizons in terms of my knowledge of cinema. And so they had all these tapes of all these great movies, and a few of them in the pile included films by Kurosawa, by Tarkovsky, by Fellini, I think, was in the pile as well. Truffaut, Godard. I think everybody was in there, all the greats. And then I see this VHS cover for Stalker, and it was this really beautiful cover. It was this really beautiful cover with two tapes, and I was like, "What is this movie?" And so I think it was actually the first one I watched out of all the films in the pile. And so I watched it on tape, and I was just so entranced by it. I was so entranced by its visuals, and I was only 17 years old at the time, and I don't think I really even understood what the film was about. I understood it on the surface level, what the film was about, but as I'm watching the images, I'm like, this is one of the most beautiful looking movies I've ever seen. And then another tape in the pile was also Nostalgia, which I watched a little bit of that one, not a lot. I liked Stalker a little bit more at the time, I think. And then I think one of his other first films was in there. So I kind of got introduced to Tarkovsky by accident that way, and just looking at the beautiful images, and it was clear to me that he is and was, I should say, a visual poet without question.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that, and I guess we'll go ahead and jump into it, and it kind of makes sense because Stalker was recently released through the Criterion Collection, was finally added to the Criterion Collection, which I've been hoping it was would be for a long time, because like you, it was actually my first introduction to Tarkovsky as well. My introduction, and I remember the videotape that you're talking about. In fact, I think I still have my original videotape. The two tapes with that really striking image of the stalker's head with green and all of that stuff.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's the one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean that was my I remember that cover vividly. Because after the way I came to Tarkovsky was it was very different from you. A few years before, it was 1994, I had absolutely fallen in love with Alex Proyas's The Crow when I first saw it. And in a review of The Crow when it came out on video, they talked about all Brandon Lee's films, but obviously The Crow was the big one. And the reviewer, I think it was Ken Tucker, was somebody at Entertainment Weekly, had mentioned in talking about the scenes where Eric Draven is going through the alleyways and going up the hallways and stuff like that of his apartment building, and the reviewer mentioned that those scenes remind him of Tarkovsky's Stalker. And that reference always fascinated with me, and it stuck in my head because I loved that movie immediately, and it shortly became my favorite movie of all time. It was where it was for a long time, but that image, that reference to Stalker stuck with me. So I tried to find that movie. In 1997. I went to a local video store. It wasn't Blockbuster or anything like that. It was a smaller chain. And I looked, and they actually had Stalker there. And so I'm like, I was really excited. Finally got to see it, and I took it home and watched it almost immediately. And I don't think I loved it as much as I do now when I first saw it, but like you, I was just transfixed by it. It was just I think it was probably my first foreign film I'd seen. And so
Really?
the fact that I had and so the fact that I had gotten this type of vibe, this type of um intense reaction to Stalker was quite amazing actually. And
Yes.
it wasn't long after that I eventually later in the summer I found it available on videotape to purchase through Media Play, which no longer exists anymore.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so and after that, they had a few other Tarkovsky films there at the video store. They had Solaris there. They had My Name Is Ivan, better known as Ivan's Childhood, and
Right.
that I watched as well. And they also had Andrei Rublev, which I started to watch but had a hard time getting into. So
I
I don't
did
think
too,
I
actually.
finished.
Yeah.
So I don't think I finished it at that point. When I got back into Tarkovsky because of the availability on Netflix, and I basically started watching all of his films that I missed earlier. I went back to Andrei Rublev, which was the Criterion disc, which actually brought back a lot of the subtitles that had been missing from the original, from the video cut, which was 3 hours, and this one includes the 20 minutes extra, and was the original cut that Tarkovsky made of Rublev, and I
Ah,
got
okay.
even more transfixed to that movie. And all of I absolutely am a great admirer of all of Tarkovsky's movies. Stalker, those always have particularly special place because of partially because of the fact that it was my first one, and partially because of the
Me
fact that
too.
it just had such a pull on me when I first saw it.
Oh, me too. Absolutely.
And I mean, when I went back to watch Stalker for this podcast, I was writing down notes for pretty much every Tarkovsky movie, just things that point out that stuck out with me and about the films. And Stalker had one of the longest lists of notes that I made of the films that Tarkovsky made. I mean, it's a movie that that's stuck with me for all time, and it's funny that a really great friend of mine who loves foreign films, that watches foreign films, he loves Solaris and Mirror, but when he borrowed Stalker from me, he couldn't get into it. And it's
Wow.
kind of interesting. And but the thing is, I kind of understand where that is coming from, because more than most of his other films, Stalker requires a tremendous amount of patience on the part of the viewer,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and so it's kind of amazing to me that that movie really latched on to me as much as it did, and really inhabited my memories, and has really stuck with me the way it has.
Yeah, I found the same myself when I was watching Stalker in preparation for this, and I actually got the Criterion recently as a Christmas gift.
Hmm.
I'm watching it, and I hadn't seen it probably in a couple of years. Probably, I think probably in a long, long time. So I didn't remember a lot of it. I just remember sections of it. But when those sections came on screen, I was immediately transfixed as I once was the first time I saw it. It just grabs you. It's a very meditative movie, I find.
Yeah. Absolutely. And as somebody who who was a music major, who music is a huge part, music and sound has always been a huge part of what resonates with me when it comes to films. One of
Hmm.
the things that always has struck me about Stalker is the use of electronic music and sound design.
Yes.
And for me as an artist, for me as a composer, it's next to 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's probably one of the most influential movies in terms of the type of music that I do, the type of music that I've written over the years. And actually, I think it was around the same time that I started really getting into Tarkovsky's work again in 2002, and after Stalker had been finally become available on DVD in the States, I actually wrote a. It hasn't been released yet because I haven't been completely recorded yet, but I wrote a piece for trombone quartet and electronics inspired by Stalker.
Wow.
And it's just a little 4-minute piece and stuff like that. But that was the influence that Tarkovsky's film had on me. I mean,
Right.
now there's so many other film. I mean, kind of all of his films have that effect on me, but few quite on the same level as Stalker.
Yeah, that's how I feel as well. I do have a copy of Nostalgia and also I always get the title wrong. Andre Rimbaud. And like you, I didn't get all that into it as well. Stalker, I always kept coming back to, no matter how many times I watched Tarkovsky film. That's the one I always came back to.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just there's something about the way that Tarkovsky builds that world, and it's so striking. It's such a simple story. The story
It
of
really is.
Stalker is just a guide leading a writer and a professor into a forbidden zone in this unnamed country that
Yes.
and it was originally adapted from a novel Roadside Picnic. And
Yeah.
how much of the making of Stalker do you know?
I don't know a whole lot, to be honest with you. I did a little bit of research, like on IMDb, prior to this, but I don't know a whole lot, to be honest with you.
Okay, I need to give you a link to follow. It's nostalgia.com. It's an appreciation page I found several years ago on Tarkovsky. And there's an article about the making of Stalker that is just absolutely remarkable. If you're a fan of Stalker, this is absolutely essential reading. But
Oh, that's awesome.
basically, Tarkovsky basically had to make the movie twice. He started off with a more direct adaptation of Roadside Picnic, which I've never read, but what happened with one cinematographer, but what happened is, and there's dispute as to whether it was sabotage on the part of the processing company who was processing the film or not. But
Right.
basically, every part of the film, most of the film that had been shot up until a certain point, was unusable
Oh,
because they
wow.
hadn't processed it correctly.
Oh,
And so he had to, so the film that as it exists now had to go in with less budget, less money, and completely different cinematographer. And it basically had to be reimagined. And
oh,
it is
jeez.
absolutely, and it was his last film in Russia. The last two
Oh,
films he had been made, the last two films he made Nostalgia in Italy, and he made The Sacrifice, which was his last film in
right.
Sweden with
Mm-hmm.
a lot of Bergman's
Mm-hmm.
crew and Erland Josephson, the who was an actor for a lot of Bergman films. And
Right.
so Stalker was he basically made the movie. I don't know if it was exactly twice, but they gotten far enough into production that it feels like I think the movie basically was done twice. But because of this freak accident on the part of the lab that was processing the film, everything was basically unusable, and there's dispute as to whether it was sabotage on the part of the Russian government, who didn't really care for Tarkovsky, and pretty much most of the films that he had made in Russia, certainly Ivan's Childhood and Andrei Rublev, had been cut over the years. Um, and there have been several different cuts of both of those movies released, although the ones on the it's weird because the one on Criterion for Ivan's Childhood is basically sort of the definitive cut, but the one that for Rublev, which is the longer cut, which was the original cut, Tarkovsky actually endorsed the shorter cut, which was right around 3 hours, as opposed to 3.5 hours for Rublev. So it's really interesting to see how much cutting. And one of the things that's interesting about Tarkovsky is while he was a filmmaker in Soviet Russia, he was very much not a Russian filmmaker in the same way that you consider Eisenstein a Russian filmmaker in terms of somebody who, who was basically just an extension of the Russian government.
Right.
And it's the profound spirituality that runs through all of Tarkovsky's work that is absolutely fascinating. And even more fascinating for Stalker, and one of the key points that this article about Stalker brings up is the fact that Tarkovsky made Stalker 7 years before the Chernobyl disaster. But if you think about what happened at Chernobyl and you look back at certain things and certain beats in the production design, certain beats in the dialogue with what happens in the room, like they talk about you kind of get the impression that the Stalker is almost prescient when it comes to the Chernobyl disaster. Because it's this zone that came up out of nowhere, maybe it was meteors, but the government is keeping people out of it.
Right.
And so, and one of the things that the professor mentions at the end of the movie after they've gotten to the room is something about the fourth bunker, and it was the fourth bunker at Chernobyl that exploded that caused that disaster. So the fact that he made this movie 7 years before Chernobyl, and the movie feels almost like a response to it, is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
One of the saddest things that I've learned over the years about Stalker is the fact that one of the tragic things about the shoe is that basically they were shooting not far from a chemical plant, and there was a lot of chemicals in the water, and so a lot of the actors and people involved with the production, including Tarkovsky himself, later died with forms of cancer and respiratory issues that a lot of people attribute to the shooting of Stalker.
From the contamination.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So it's there's so many fascinating things about Stalker. I mean, this isn't even just like all of the things I'm talking about isn't even really representative of the context of the film necessarily. It's just talking about things that have happened that have come up in response to the film.
Right.
One of the amazing things, one of the things that I like about Stalker, and one of the things that Tarkovsky was always great about, was his use of color versus black and white, or in the case of Stalker, sepia tone.
Yes.
And the fact that sepia tone in this movie represents the real world, and the zone is in this lush, really haunting color cinematography is just absolutely it's such an inspired touch, because another filmmaker would reverse it and it's not necessarily going to have the same effect.
Absolutely, yeah. That was one of the things I remember when I first saw the movie that really fascinated me, was the switch from sepia tone to color. Immediately as a young teenager, the first thing I thought of was Wizard of Oz. Of course, it's nothing like the Wizard of Oz in any way, but it had that same sort of magic, I guess you could say, because I agree, it is very haunting and very lush, and then you go into the reality, it's very dirty, it's very has a not so beautiful brown, so it was very
Mm-hmm.
haunting, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I noticed in watching it before this podcast was it for me it feels like the stalker, even though there's a writer, even though there's a professor in the film, um, I feel like the stalker's Tarkovsky's representation of an artist, and he is only a piece in the world that when he is leading people into the zone, and just
Hmm.
as an artist is really he finds his greatest piece creating art. The the stalker is only a piece when he's doing his what he sees as his purpose.
Mm. That's
And
a Yeah.
and one of the questions that one of the questions that came up for me in the film this past time is you kind of wonder whether, and I think one of the filmmaker and I think one of the characters in the movie brings this possibility up, is there's a question of whether the stalker is sort of a con man who's just making up these rules for the writer and the professor to uh, follow when they're in the zone. It's like, oh, only
Yeah.
follow this direction, only follow this direction. If you have to go this certain way, you can't go back the same way you could.
Right.
And you know, or does he have real faith when it comes to his purpose in life and what the zone can bring to people's lives?
Right.
And one of the things that, because this is, it's a long movie, it's 2 hours 40 minutes, uh,
Sure.
and one of the things that I like, one of the last things that I wrote down about Stalker, and one of the things that really kind of hits home for me is that it it feels like a representation of the adage that it's not the destination, but it's the journey that matters. Because
Yes.
really, when they get to the room, it's kind of an anticlimax.
Right.
It's the destination, it's the journey to get to the room that's the real drama, the real satisfaction of the movie. Once they get to the room, it's kind of mundane in a way.
Yeah. Yep.
Because I mean, they nobody actually goes into the room. They just go to the end, to where the
To
end
the end.
is,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and then we see them back at the bar that they all met at the beginning.
Right.
What one of the thing, and I will admit, like I personally, unfortunately, I haven't been able to get the Criterion myself. I really want to, because I want to see the movie in Blu-ray. I want to see it restored. I can't imagine it not looking absolutely stunning
Oh yeah,
with
it
the
is.
work that Criterion does. And it's also interesting because I've never actually seen the movie without having to switch a disc or switch a tape halfway in between. So it's like that's kind of another incentive to get the Criterion,
Of
because
course.
of the fact that
Yeah.
it's like I can just watch it straight through now.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right.
what sort of thoughts did cross your mind when you were watching Stalker again recently?
So having watched it again recently, right off the bat, the one thing again I have to point out, and this is hallmark in Tarkovsky's work, is his cinematography, his use of long tracking shots and long takes are just that's probably one of my favorite things about his work, is just how beautiful that aspect is
Yeah,
in an age where everything is very fast cuts and everything is very quick, particularly in big budget blockbusters these days. It was so refreshing to see a film just breathe.
yeah,
And I can't imagine. I can't imagine a film like this having so many fast cuts because this film is so meditative and it's just so beautiful that it would be a disservice to the story because, as you said, the film, in the end, for me, I agree, is about the journey of finding something rather than the end result. And so I feel as though by getting these long takes in this world that he's creating, that in a way we're living with the characters in that world, with the music and with the very natural sound effects, and again, and the use of very little dialogue for a good chunk of it. It was beautiful to just listen to. This is a movie that I could put on. I could not see the visuals and just listen to. It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
But thematically, one of the things I found was the same exact thing you just pointed out was the journey of it all, and I found for me when I first watched it as a 17-year-old versus how I watch it now as a 28-year-old male, I see it now in a totally different way. As I gotten older, I see more philosophical type of messages going on around here, which is clear what he was going for, and so I learned to appreciate it more on that level myself.
Yeah, and you brought up the amount of long takes in the film, and was I think it was IMDb where I saw that there really are not a lot of edits in this film
No,
from one take to another. And when I saw the amount, I started I couldn't believe it, but at the same point, I could believe it because of the fact that I had seen the movie so much. I know how it after a certain point you don't notice the fact that it's not cutting. Like
right.
even the scene which is arguably which is the most what most moviegoers would probably consider the most exciting scene, which is when they're trying to sneak into the zone and you have the soldiers going after them and all of the sound effects associated with that. There's not an edit in that scene.
There's not.
and
No,
and but if a lesser director got their hands on that scene, there'd be an edit every 3 seconds. And
absolutely. Yep.
but the thing is, you don't need it because of the way he stages it. It's just so amazing, and you understand it's the momentum of that scene that takes you. It doesn't matter how much editing you do.
Right.
It's the momentum of that. And yeah, the fact that he is very deliberate, he's very specific when it comes to his editing. And I mean, it's not just Stalker, it's every movie of his.
Every
That's
movie. Right.
like that as well. And it's just amazing that. And I mean that's part of the reason I mentioned 2001 earlier when it came to the music and the sound design. I mean, to me, this has always been a. I mean, we can talk about Solaris a little bit, but and Solaris has always been kind of considered his response to 2001, but I think Stalker has more in common with 2001, and at least from a filmmaking standpoint, than Solaris does.
Right. Right. Oh no, I was just gonna say that I definitely agree with that. Solaris, admittedly, I've only seen once. I barely remember it at all. But I definitely see the 2001 reference
Yeah.
here. For sure. And so I actually have Stalker on my television right now, kind of like looking back at some of the images. As we're talking about it, because and there is something very 2001 esque about it, for sure.
Yeah, and I've only seen, let's see, I've only seen Solaris. I did watch it again recently to write down some notes, and it's funny because of the fact that it's arguably Tarkovsky's most accessible feature. Even though it's like Stalker, it's 2 hours and 40 minutes long. It's arguably his most accessible feature in terms of the narrative. But the funny
Right.
thing is, it's like I was watching it recently. I had a hard time. keeping interested in it. I had a very difficult time keeping interested in it, and it was really weird because of the fact that it's, like it has this reputation, and I can see that from a structural standpoint, it's one of his most successful films. I mean, it was remade about 15 years ago by Soderbergh and James
Right.
Cameron
Right.
with
Right.
George Clooney. But yeah, it was, for some reason, it just didn't really have the hold on me that some of Tarkovsky's other films do. And I don't
Yes.
necessarily think it's because of the fact that it's one of his more accessible films. It might be because of the fact that that story and the way that Tarkovsky tells that story just doesn't. I mean, I still think it's a very good movie. It's a beautiful movie to watch, like all of his
Hmm.
movies. But at the same time, I have a hard time giving myself over to it the way I do Stalker.
Right.
But I mean, there's a to discuss Solaris a little bit. I mean, you have not necessarily with when it comes to black and white and color, but you have the use of filters that Tarkovsky uses when it comes to the cinematography of the music of Solaris. You've got a lot of sequences with very few cuts that are used that where the action just basically is allowed to just go on about its business, and just seeing the film progress, seeing different scenes play out as they will. And I think that might be part of the reason that Solaris doesn't really work for me, is because, and so the same type of style that Stalker had doesn't necessarily lend itself to a more conventional narrative like Solaris.
Yeah. No, I definitely see what you're saying. I'm actually watching a few clips of Solaris right now from YouTube. And right off the bat, I see exactly the points you're making, particularly about the color. It's so luscious and so beautiful, and the use of filters. It's a gorgeous looking movie for what I'm looking at so far.
Yeah, yeah, it's just very weird that Solaris is the movie that just, I don't know, it in a way it's kind of my least favorite Tarkovsky. I mean, I like
Interesting.
all of them, but it just doesn't resonate with me. I think the way it probably should, especially with his personal, especially with the type of story that has,
Right.
which is a very personal story and a very supposed to be a very emotional story. I don't necessarily feel those emotions coming out the way they do in other Tarkovsky's films, like Stalker and Yvonne's Childhood.
No, 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 I see what you're saying. Yeah, I have to see it again to really, because it's been years since I've seen it. I had a hard time of hunting it down. But the 2002 movie, just out of curiosity, how does that compare with Tarkovsky's version?
It's, well, I mean, for one thing, it's shorter. It's shorter by about an hour,
Right.
which is not surprising. It's a Hollywood film, and it's funny because of the fact that I mean, I remember that movie. It's been years since I've seen the Soderbergh film. I know at the time I thought Tarkovsky's film was better. I would be curious to see them both sort of like back to back now to see which version
Yeah.
of the story that I like. I know there are differences in what Soderbergh emphasized in his telling of the story versus what Tarkovsky did.
Hmm.
It was funny because of the fact that one of the things I remember about Solaris, because we had at the movie theater and people hated that movie, like they could
Oh,
not
jeez.
stand it. They were expecting something else because it was George Clooney, and they were, I think they were expecting something more conventional. And
Hmm.
it's funny, my mother and I went to go see it together. I liked it, she didn't. And it's funny because
Wow.
of the fact that I was getting ready to go to bed, and I went out to the living room, and she was actually watching the Tarkovsky version on Turner Classic Movies. And
Oh,
one of the things, and I don't think she ended up seeing the entire thing, but one of the things that she said, which really kind of blew my mind because I couldn't imagine Tarkovsky resonating with her at all, was the fact that she really liked what he had done with the story better in Soderbergh. And that just
interesting.
kind of blew my mind, the fact that she would say that. It's like, I never expected, I could never see her watching, I could never see her having that reaction to like Stalker or really
Sure.
any of his other movies. And a big part of that is because of how long they are and how deliberately paced they are.
Yes.
So I mean that was always really interesting. But yeah, I wanted to watch the Soderbergh film in addition to this, but I never really got to it. But I do want to go back and rewatch the Soderbergh film and then kind of rewatch the Tarkovsky film and see how I feel about it in terms of which one I like better.
Sure.
So we've talked about Tarkovsky's two science fiction entries, Stalker and Solar. So I'm sure we'll bring them up again, because really, if you think about a lot of from a visual and thematic standpoint, there's a lot of connective tissue to be made, not just between Stalker and Solaris, but also between the rest of Tarkovsky's films. But the film that I want to transition to next is one that I think you'll really enjoy. It is actually his diploma film that came out on DVD. I think 2002 it came out. It's the Steamroller and the Violin. Have you ever had a chance to see that?
I know. I never seen that one.
I think you would really like it. It is. It's about 40 minutes long. It's not.
Oh,
So it's not a feature film. It's a shorter film. It
sure.
was never released theatrically, but I know. I think Kino eventually did release it on DVD. I think in 2002, 2003.
Uh-huh.
But it's basically about a young boy who plays the violin who becomes friends with a guy in his 20s who drives a steamroller. And it's basically about an afternoon that they spend together. And it's a very simple story. It's the closest thing to a conventional narrative that Tarkovsky ever made.
Oh,
And basically, the way that these two connect is uh, some of the classmates for the kid are bullying him, and the guy who drives the steamroller, comes to his aid. And so it's a very simple story. It's 40 minutes. It's even an entertaining story. It's the closest thing to a genuinely sort of quote unquote generic entertaining movie that Tarkovsky ever made, and it's funny to look at it in the context of the rest of his work and realize just how radically different it is from everything else.
right.
There's not really much more. There's not really much to say about it. It's very straightforward. It's very conventional, but it's very fun. I think it's not available on Netflix streaming, but if you still do the disc rental, I'm sure you can probably find it somewhere, maybe even on YouTube.
Right.
To find the Steamroller and the Violin. It's really an entertaining movie, and based on the films that you've made over the years that I've seen, I think you would enjoy it.
Oh, yeah. I love to check it out. Yeah. I, yeah. There's a few from his early filmography I have to check out, including Ivan's Child. I haven't seen that one either.
Well, like I said, that was actually one of the first ones that I'd seen when I first started again to Tarkovsky's work in '97. But I saw it under the title "My Name Is Ivan,"
Ah,
and
okay.
it was but the Criterion Collection has released that as well under the title Ivan's Childhood, which is the original film and which is the original title, and it's basically so Ivan's childhood is basically the story of a boy who has lost his family in war. I believe it's World War II, and he finds himself he's basically finds himself under the care of the Russian army, and
Mm-hmm.
he is played by Nikolai Burlyev, who also played the bellmaker at the end of Andrei Rublev a few years
Oh.
later. And the characters he plays in Ivan's childhood and Rublev are very strong, very similar. They're both headstrong. They're both arrogant, and they don't suffer authority that thinks it knows better than him. He basically, we can talk about Rublev at greater length, but like basically, Ivan makes himself sort of indispensable to the Russian army in Ivan's childhood, but it's a very stark look at a childhood that is interrupted by war. And watching it, watching it and taking notes, one of the things that struck me, and I haven't seen this movie in forever, and I need to see it again. I wondered if Steven Spielberg had this film in mind, Ivan's childhood in mind, when he made Empire of the Sun,
Oh.
because there's a lot of, in terms of the personalities of Christian Bale's character in Empire of the Sun with Ivan, there's a lot of similarity in their personalities that I think you could almost make the argument that I mean, I know Empire of the Sun is based on a book by J.G. Ballard, but at the same time, I can see a lot of similarities between the two protagonists, and it was really
Right.
interesting to think about that. So,
Hmm.
yeah, definitely, I would definitely recommend Yvonne's Childhood. That's a movie sort of the opposite of Solaris. My opinion of Yvonne's Childhood has actually increased over the years. I don't know if I would put quite up with my favorite films of Tarkovsky's, but it's definitely one that I admire now more now than than I did when I first saw it.
Yeah, yeah, I noticed too. It's also one of the shorter ones at just an hour and a half.
Yeah, yeah, it's like yeah, it is. With the exception of Steamroller and the Violin, it is his shortest film. It's like 90
Right.
minutes. And one of the, but I wouldn't put it in the same way of Solaris in that it's a conventional story. It's a more
Right.
conventional story because one of the things that intrigues, one of the intriguing things about Tarkovsky is his use of what he called poetic linkages, which
Yes.
he used to enhance the emotional impact of the film. And Yvonne Childhood has quite a few of these, and they can come in flashbacks with Yvonne and his mother. It can come in the form of a scene of an unrelated scene between two members of the Russian army. And
Mm-hmm.
it's basically stuff that enhances the emotional power of the film without dulling the realities of the story that Tarkovsky's telling.
Right.
And the have you read Tarkovsky's book Sculpting in Time?
No, I didn't know he wrote a book.
Yes, he
Yeah.
wrote a book in the 80s. I know it was finished. I know it was finished up right. He was working on The Sacrifice at the time he wrote it. It's a fascinating book, but like his films, it is a very methodical and can be sometimes difficult read. It
Wow.
requires a lot of patience on the part of the reader
Let's
to
read it right.
read, but it's definitely worth it if you can, because the way he writes about film is very dense and very if you're familiar with his films at all, it makes all the sense in the world because his whole view on cinema is laid bare in Sculpting in Time, and it's a fascinating read if you're familiar with Tarkovsky. But it can definitely be a chore, but it's well worth it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm looking right now for copies. Amazon, it's going for as high as $112.
Oh wow.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Wow, yeah. It was cheaper when I bought it a lot of
Yeah.
years ago. But yeah, it's I don't know, maybe eBay you might be able to find
Yeah,
something cheaper.
probably. Yeah.
Uh but yeah, it's it's not something you're necessarily going to find at Barnes and Noble or anything like that.
Right.
But
Of course. Yeah.
it's definitely it's definitely fascinating to read if you're a fan of Tarkovsky,
That's
and
really fascinating.
especially if you're an admirer of his work, even if you don't. I mean, I love I love Tarkovsky as a filmmaker. He's one of my favorite filmmakers of all time,
Yeah.
and it's even if it's especially if you kind of have to love Tarkovsky to really commit to reading that book. But
Right.
if you do, if you want some insight into one of the most uncompromising film artists of all time, it's definitely worth a read.
That's great. So he writes about cinema, and he writes about his excuse me, writes about his work. Is that what the book is about?
Yeah, he goes through each film.
Interesting.
You see him talk about each film. He does spend a lot of time and about his philosophy on filmmaking. And
Oh.
it's really like it's one of the most nakedly personal books you could ever imagine a
Mm.
filmmaker reading writing. It's
Mm.
absolutely fascinating, and it's really great insight into the director that you just never would have expected. I mean, I was like you. I didn't necessarily know that he had written for a while. I don't remember when I eventually got the book, but
Yeah.
I was like, wow, he wrote. I think it might have been mentioned. I think it was mentioned in one of the essays they had in the Criterion of Yvonne's childhood. The
Oh,
author, one
okay.
of the authors might mention it. That's where I'm like, he wrote a book, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I had to get it. I'm like, okay, this is. It took me a while to read it, but it was definitely well worth
Yeah.
reading.
Yeah. I'm looking for it on eBay right now. And another book, which I was just reminded of as I'm browsing on eBay, that I've been meaning to get, but I kept forgetting to purchase it or look at it, is a book of all his Polaroids that he took. Um, uh, it's called Instant Light, Tarkovsky's Polaroids, and it's all the photographs that he took.
Oh wow, wow, that would be yeah, that would be fascinating to watch as well. To That would be fascinating to look at as
To
well.
read, yeah, and look at, yeah.
Um, yeah, and I mean one thing that we haven't mentioned yet that is kind of important to who Tarkovsky is his father was a renowned poet.
Oh,
And he quotes his father's poetry in Stalker. One of the
yes.
his poetry is quote in Stalker, and the other film, and it's also mentioned in Nostalgia as well. And in the early parts of Nostalgia, I think one of the characters, I think it's the writer, the main character, mentions Arsenev Tarkovsky's poetry.
Oh yeah, yeah. I remember seeing the opening credits recently. I had no idea that was his father. I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
yeah.
Wow,
hmm
very fascinating.
So we so we so I brought up nostalgia, and so that's probably the next logical place to go. Like I said, was earlier, it was made in Italy. It was his first film after Stalker, and was released in '83. Um, it Nostalgia is an interesting film. I've always really it's kind of always been for me sort of the dividing point between the films of Tarkovsky's that I love versus the films of Tarkovsky's I more admire than really love. It's
Right.
always sort of been behind in that sort of. It's always sort of been that fulcrum point. For the most part, I do love it though. It's a fascinating. It's an interesting film. It's uh, it's about a writer who is who is in Italy to do research on a Russian composer, and you don't see that so much. You see him go through some of the motions, but it a lot of the thematic uh, material, and it's one of the reasons why I think that it's probably one of Tarkovsky's most personal films is because of the fact that it feels like a reflection of what his mood probably would have been like being outside of Russia, because he was I don't know why I don't know why he necessarily left Russia. I know he can necessarily after Stalker he probably just couldn't really get films made in Russia anymore, so he had to go
Yeah.
elsewhere. But the last two films he made, Nostalgia and The Sacrifice, were made outside of Russia. And Nostalgia, you really get the impression that Tarkovsky is laying bare his emotions about being outside of Russia for
Hmm.
what would end up being the end of his life. And you mentioned that was one of the films that they gave you. Uh,
That's right. Yep.
and
Yep.
what how do you feel about the movie?
I've only seen it maybe twice, and the two times I saw it, it was a hard film for me to get through because
Mm-hmm.
of how meditative it was, and how personal it was, and I can't really say I understood all of it, but visually, I truly appreciated it. I love the fact that the opening shot, for example, where you see a car come in, and he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
even follow the car. He follows the car for like maybe a couple of feet, and then he holds the shot there. You're like, okay, what's going on here? And the car pulls right up. It's like there again demonstrating the same use of long takes. As he and visually, it reminds me a lot of Stalker. A lot of the color scenes, very beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember also this one haunting shot of seeing the leading character, the writer actually, I believe it was,
Yeah.
carrying a candle, and
Mm-hmm.
Tarzovsky follows him for a good long period of time. You don't see where he's going, and then when he reaches with the candle uh, to where he was, and there's one point in the shot where he's obscured by mist and by dust in the air. You can't even see it. Uh, and I remember thinking how daring that was as a filmmaker to present these images and not give the audience a clear vision as to where we are in the geography, but purposefully. It was a real breath of fresh air to see that as an aspiring filmmaker.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about the end of the film, right?
You believe so? Yes, yes.
Where he's in the pool, and Erland Josephson, who's in this movie as well as the sacrifice. He's told the writer Erland Josephson's character in this movie is really interesting. And it's kind of a it's kind of the same character he ends up playing in the sacrifice, which was Tarkovsky's last film. And
Right.
both men are paranoid of the world, but they have a faith that is singular and that it's hard to explain. And there's I think there's definitely a lot of Tarkovsky in this character type as well. But Erland Josephson's character, the writer becomes fascinated by him. He sees him at this pool in the middle of town, and he's basically known as the crazy person around the town.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got that reputation, but the writer, who's the main characters, become fascinated by him, and so he gets to talking. He goes visits this man at his house, and the man tells him about this task that he has tried to accomplish. He's never quite finished it though, which is to go into the pool, this empty pool, hold a candle, and try to make it from one end of the pool to the other without the candle going out.
Oh.
And so at the end, we've already seen there's a scene where Erlen Josephson's character, and you kind of get the impression that he's very much a he's one of these guys who, you know, in America we would see him and he would be like preaching the end of the world, and which
Right.
is not unlike what he is in the Sacrifice. And
Yes.
he self-immolates himself as a form of protest against the world. And so immediately after that, Tarkovsky uses the Ode to Joy by Beethoven to
Mm-hmm.
just amazing effect in that scene. And so the next scene, the final scene of the movie, we see the writer actually in the pool, and he is lighting the candle, and he is trying to get from one end of the pool to the other. And he has to stop because of the fact a couple of times, I think, because of the fact that the candle goes out. So
Right.
after that, he goes back to the beginning, the end of the pool, lights the candle again, and keeps going. And
Keeps going, right.
yeah, it is. And so the last scene of the movie, the last shot of the movie is he is, and it's funny because of the fact that you distinctly notice it, and I wonder, you know, whether it would. It's curious. It's a moment that really, I'm sure, something that may not have necessarily been intentional, but there's one moment in the where he is going. He does make it all the way. He does eventually make it to the end of the pool.
Yeah.
And you kind of get the impression that you almost get the impression that the writer dies. Although I don't know if he dies, but he's exhausted by having completed this task. It's a very simple task. It's holding
Yeah.
a candle from one end of a pool to the other. But anyway, there's one moment in the sequence when he does make it, and that is when you see him. It's the one moment that you see him really cover the candle to where the flame is obscured.
Yes.
And it's the one moment where it's like, what you almost, psychologically speaking, you almost look for an invisible cut that may have happened, like, oh crap, it went out. So
It went out, right.
you cut it and then you just keep going, and
You
you
just
got
yeah.
keep it at the same angle, and then you go forward. But yeah, it's one moment that's always stuck out with that sequence for me. And it's just this, and I remember Roger Ebert talking about that sequence when he reviewed Solaris for his great movie series. And when he saw the movie for the first time at, I think, Telluride was when he saw it, and it basically it's one of those sequences where it's like you either it's a reflection of Tarkovsky's work in general, where it's like you either love it or you hate it. There
Or you
really
hate it,
isn't
right.
there really isn't a moment in between, because of the fact that, you know, you just it's either going to bore you to tears or it's just going to completely engross you. And that's definitely a reflection on Tarkovsky's work in general. I mean, it really is an amazing commitment to follow Tarkovsky, and I completely get if people are not able to do it because of the fact that it's like there are so many of his, even though I love so many of his movies, it's difficult to get through them. And
Oh, I agree.
like, and the one movie that came between Solaris and Stalker, uh, which was another one of his shorter films. It's about 100 minutes. but was also another one of his more personal films was The Mirror.
Oh, okay, yeah, I remember that one. Yeah,
Yeah. Have you seen it?
long time ago, but yes, I have seen it.
Yeah. And it's almost a silent film. There's very little dialogue in the movie. And one of the things that's interesting about Tarkovsky is the fact that he doesn't really rely on dialogue. He relies on images. And
Yes.
the images are what matter. And The Mirror is full of just beautiful images to watch. And was actually I got excited because of the fact that when the 2012 Sight and Sound poll came out, The Mirror was actually ninth on the director's
Oh,
list. It was the first time any of Tarkovsky's films had cracked either of the critics or the director's top 10. And I get why directors relate to Mirror because of the fact that it's all about experimenting with the form of visual storytelling
yes.
and what personal filmmaking is. And we talked a little bit about poetic linkages in Tarkovsky's work when we talked about Ivan's childhood, and they're throughout all of his film. But The Mirror is chock full of them. And you
Right.
have individual montages, you have images that connect emotionally but not narratively. And it's one of those amazing movies. It is one of my favorite movies. It's right there with Stalker and Rublev for me. It's one of those movies where it's like sort of like you with nostalgia, where it's like I don't necessarily get what's going on as far as a general story, but I just
Yeah.
can't look away at it. It's just very
I,
beautiful.
that's what I find myself with most of Tarkovsky's films is I can't really say I fully understand everything that's going on, or even really have the patience to to watch in full. But you can't help but not keep looking because he just presents to you something so beautiful that you do want to keep watching. So he's always made very engrossing movies, and while they are challenging, when you finish them, you have this appreciation of not just for the work themselves, but for what he was trying to say in them. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned that Tarkovsky's father was a poet.
Right.
And when it comes to The Mirror, there's only a handful of dialogue in the film that actually feels necessary the to an appreciation of the film, and that's the
Right.
narration that we hear, and there are poetic readings from Tarkovsky's father. And those are the only moments of dialogue and speaking in the film that feel really necessary to understanding sort of where Tarkovsky is coming from when it comes to
Hmm.
the film in general.
Right. And again, he's using the sepia tone in the opening scenes. There are those little hallmarks, such as the poems and such as the visuals. You know
Hmm.
right away it's a Tarkovsky film.
Yeah, and it's one of those movies that you really see the connection between Tarkovsky and Bergman come through
Yes.
because there's
Yep.
the opening of The Mirror really reminds me sort of the the opening of Bergman's Hour of the Wolf, which breaks the
Okay.
fourth wall, and you have like a character in the movie actually talking to the audience. And I don't know if you've seen Hour of the Wolf. It's the closest thing I think to a horror film that Bergman ever made,
Oh,
other
interesting.
than maybe Persona. But
Yeah, I was gonna mention Persona. Yeah.
yeah, it starts with Liv Ullman in character discussing her on-screen husband, who is played by Max von Sydow. We haven't seen him yet. Before that, over the credits of Hour of the Wolf, you hear basically you hear the sounds you would hear on the building of a film set. And so it
Hmm.
sort of breaks the fourth wall, and I feel like the beginning of The Mirror sort of is Tarkovsky's homage to what Bergman's doing in that film, and at least the opening of that film. But I think there are other films, not just The Sacrifice, but also to a certain extent nostalgia that I think share a lot more in common with Bergman than The Mirror does. But
Yes.
that's one of the more interesting little aspects of The Mirror that I really like. That you sort of see this relationship to the experimental nature that sometimes Bergman could play in at times when as a storyteller.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Some of the yeah, I agree. I mean, when I think of Bergman, yeah, some of Bergman and some of Tarkovsky, they do have a lot of similarity. Another filmmaker I would actually compare Tarkovsky to as well, or rather, other way around, Terrence Malick. That he has a
Yes.
lot of Tarkovsky in his work. You know, just a lot of the same sort of visual sensibility and the sort of poetry that he brings into his work.
Mm-hmm. No, and I haven't seen every Terrence Malick film, but I mean I've definitely seen enough to where yeah that connection to Tarkovsky is very clear. I mean
Yeah,
it's been years since I've seen Badlands and Days of Heaven. Actually, it's been years since I've seen pretty much any Terrence
yeah,
Malick film. I admire Malick more than I like him.
right.
There are parts of his filmmaking style that I really like, but for the most part, I just have never really gotten into him the way that I have
Yeah,
filmmakers like Tarkovsky.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I definitely see the connections with Malick's work as well, especially when you see, especially with uh, the Tree of Life. I can
Yep.
you can definitely
Hmm.
see a lot of Tarkovsky there. Thin Red Line. I can definitely see a lot
Yep.
of that style, and it especially with not just Stalker. Although I mean, I think that from a standpoint of uh, the long takes. Certainly, I think Yvonne there are moments in Thin Red Line that probably were influenced by Yvonne's childhood as well.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, I definitely see the connection. That there's definitely a connection that can be made between those two.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's weird because of the fact that to a certain extent it's kind of disingenuous to just compare Tarkovsky to Kubrick. I mean,
Oh yeah.
that's one of the more obvious connections you can make as far as American filmmakers. But at the same
Right.
time, Kubrick is even some of his even something like Barry Lyndon or 2001's a completely different ball game from what Tarkovsky's doing. Although,
Right. Exactly.
I mean, 2000. Yeah, I mean, you know, if I remember correctly, in the Solaris Criterion one in the essay they have there, like it says that, or maybe it was Roger Ebert's review, but basically Tarkovsky wasn't a fan of 2001, so to a certain extent, that might have been that might have been part of the reason he made Solaris. But in the same point, I feel like I've always had this. I've always felt this connection between 2001 and Stalker. So,
Yes.
but and I feel like Stalker's the more personal of the films, sci-fi films that Tarkovsky made, and yet it's got a lot in common with me for me to a film that Tarkovsky allegedly didn't even really care for.
Yeah,
So
that's really interesting. I didn't know that, but I think one of the reasons why uh, Stalker does feel more personal, because if you look at 2001, Kubrick, many accuse Kubrick of being a very cold filmmaker, but I feel like that was he used that to his advantage. I felt like there was a purpose for that. So he wasn't exactly like a he was a personal filmmaker, but not quite in the sense of showing a lot of heart. He showed the truth.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I feel like Tarkovsky showed the truth while also showing himself. So a lot of what you see is Tarkovsky himself. I think that's the big difference between the two of them if you can make any kind of comparison.
oh yeah, definitely. I mean, and the thing is, it's like I do think, and I would almost argue that like both Kubrick and Tarkovsky reveal a lot about themselves in their work. It's just
Yes,
that what they reveal, like Kubrick reveals more the cynicism of his worldview than Tarkovsky does.
exactly. Yep.
Tarkovsky is revealing his emotional connection
Hmm.
to the world and
Exactly.
to life in general, and that's one of the things that comes through crystal clear in every one of his films. From Steamroller and the Violin and Yvonne's Childhood to Solaris, The Mirror, Stalker, and Nostalgia, all the way up to the last film they made, The Sacrifice, which he made as he was dying. He
Wow.
actually died shortly after it was released in America. Have you ever seen The Sacrifice?
That's one of the few I haven't seen either.
Okay. Sacrifice. It's a movie that it's sort of like Yvonne's Childhood, where my feelings about it gotten had have become more appreciative than they probably were the first time I saw it.
Hmm.
It's basically, I talked about it a little bit with when it came to nostalgia because they both star Erland Josephson. The movie was made in Sweden on the island of Faro. Sven Nykvist, who was Bergman's longtime cinematographer, shot the Sacrifice, and
Ah.
is and Erland Josephson's character. It is his birthday, and he has friends and family coming to celebrate with him. And during the day, during a point in the day, they feel jet fighter jets go overhead, and they hear on the radio that the bombs for World War III have left, and they're on the brink of World War III. The sacrifice of the title is Erland Josephson's character asks God to sacrifice his family and loved ones if uh, he will sacrifice himself for his family and loved ones. It
Oh.
is, and it is one of the most, even though it's sort of in between Tarkovsky's films as far as length, it's only about 2 hours and 20 minutes compared to
Sure.
Stalker and Rublev and Solaris. But it is, I mean, if you want to talk about long takes with uh, Stalker, Solaris or The Sacrifice certainly is not bereft of long takes, and
Ah.
it's very deliberately paced, and it's definitely the work of somebody who had mortality fresh on the brain.
Yeah.
Which and there's if you ever see The Sacrifice, it's available on Blu-ray, I believe, through Kino. That's
Okay.
how I have it on Blu-ray. There's an amazing documentary called, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky, that was basically filmed during the making of The Sacrifice. It's been on every DVD and even video release of The Sacrifice. It is narrated by Brian Cox, and it is one of the great essential documentaries about making a film. I think if if the book Sculpting in Time sounds a bit unwieldy, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky is a great alternative because you really get a clear distinction with Tarkovsky's filmmaking process as he's going through The Sacrifice. And the big climax, and one of the things that there are a lot of things that came through watching Sacrifice in preparation for this podcast is the beginning of The Sacrifice, where Erland Josephson's character and his very young son. Erland Josephson is not a young guy. He was
Right.
in the 80s. He was even then kind of on the older side, but he's got a very young son in this movie. And they are planning they're planning a tree, a Japanese tree. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Josephson's character is very fascinated by Japanese culture, and you see him in kimonos. You see him listening to Japanese music uh, at some points in the film. The opening scene with Josephson, the boy, and the mailman who's come to thank to wish him a happy birthday and is a friend of theirs. It's one of the warmest scenes Tarkovsky has ever made. It's full
Oh.
of it's filled with humor and a lot of heart, and it's not much in the way of the more philosophical discussions that we'll certainly get into later in the film.
Mm-hmm.
And it really sort of lays out it sort of it does a good job of kind of laying out the stakes for Josephson's character as the film goes along. And but one of the things that's interesting is there's a question lingering over the film as to whether World War III is actually going to happen, whether it's something within the reality of the film or whether it's a dream of Josephson's character. You're never
Right.
quite sure because at the end, uh, and we're going to get into spoilers here. The movie's 30 years old, but the fact of the matter is, it's it's a fascinating movie, and if you're a Tarkovsky fan, it's definitely well worth seeking out, regardless of whether you know anything about the movie or not. If
Right.
only to watch the way he ends this movie. But by the end of the movie, you have the basically the middle of the movie is devoted entirely to Josephson's characters, his struggles with this question of World War III and this sacrifice that he wants to make for his loved ones, of
Right.
his life for theirs. But there's an interesting question as to whether that he's dreamed that World War III is happening or whether it is actually a part of, and is a part of reality of the movie. And part of the reason that you can question is at the very end of the movie, when Josephson's character has really reached very much the same emotional grounding that Josephson's character Nostalgia makes when he has his protest and self-immolation at the end of the movie. You see his family members eating breakfast the next day as if nothing is going on, as if nothing extraordinary is going on.
Right.
And so you that's one of the things that makes you wonder, well, is this really all happening or is it something that's just in his thoughts? And it really is it really is fitting that this was the movie that Tarkovsky was made as he was dying. It's about bargains and the sacrifices one makes at a time when we know that we may die. And given who Tarkovsky was as a filmmaker, it's hard to imagine an end of his career that would be as fitting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's not. Well, it sounds. It sounds. I'm curious to see it now based on that description alone.
And I haven't even gotten to probably one of the most amazing set pieces in the movie, which I will not spoil because it truly does merit seeing the movie just to get to the climax. Which and when you watch directed by Andrei Tarkovsky, you will see just how amazing the way he made this climax is. It just really it is an image that you will never forget. It is comparable to it is comparable to the ending of Andrei Rublev, which is the one film we haven't really touched on yet.
Hmm.
But I do have to say, if you haven't seen The Sacrifice, I definitely recommend it, especially if you're a Tarkovsky fan. Watch that and watch directed by Andrei Tarkovsky.
Yeah.
They're always like I said, they've always kind of been a double bill together on home releases, and you will be absolutely transported by the way the ending of this film unfolds. It is just
Interesting.
it's just something that I've never forgotten from the first time I saw this film, and it's just
Ah,
something else.
that's awesome.
So we are going to close. It's weird because of the fact that my two favorite Tarkovsky films. The first one is probably Stalker, which we talked a lot about earlier, and I think it's safe to say it's probably your favorite as well. And
Absolutely, it is my favorite. Yep.
my next favorite is his 1966 film Andrei Rublev, which is
Ah.
one of the greatest films I've ever seen. And it is I sometimes go I've in the past few years I've sort of gone back and forth as to whether I consider this my favorite or not. But in the end I think really Stalker's the one that solidifies it. Andrei Rublev is a largely it's interesting because it's about a real person. It's about a real Russian icon painter from the 14th century. It has real events that take place in it. The Tartar invasion, namely, and the that opens the second part of Rublev, but it is largely there's not a whole lot known specifically about Rublev apart from
Hmm.
his art. So this is basically it's a biopic, but not like in the sense of how we feel about biopics.
Right.
It was really it was a movie he got into a lot of trouble for with the Russian censors. There were a few cuts of this movie made. We already talked about the original cut of the movie was close to 3.5 hours.
Oh.
The original cut that I saw in video or started to see on video was a little over 3 hours. It 20 minutes of the cut, 20 minutes of the movies that had been cut. But apparently, there's another one that was cut by 40 minutes that was released in America in the 70s, and I don't even want to think about what that cut was like because of the fact that I can't imagine it being less than what it is. Andrei Rublev is a fascinating film because it is very episodic. It deals with episodes in the life of Rublev without really a straight line narrative. Even though, if you really think of the structure of the film, it deals with a straight line narrative.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's interesting about the balloon, the introduction with the balloon, as well as the casting of the bell at the end, is that one is a great accomplishment that fails, the other is a great accomplishment that succeeds. So you have this through line of success and failure happening on a continuum. And it's the faith of the people who are doing those acts that is essential to the audacity of what they're doing. And that's something that's constant throughout Tarkovsky's film. Because one of the key points in the film that we get to is Andrei Rublev has been commissioned to paint the Last Supper in a church, but
Hmm.
he basically gets artist block. He can't do it because he doesn't feel comfortable doing it because of
Right.
what that scene would mean, what that scene would represent. And so that's kind of the middle point for this this faith of artists or creators who are doing something that they are very passionate about, and we see moments that fail, moments that succeed, and moments in the middle where you see the doubts about what they're
Hmm.
doing. Rublev just is absolutely there's so much to unpack about Andrei Rublev, and it's fascinating because of the fact that there are a lot of it feels like there's a lot of dialogue in the Criterion release, uh, which is the full 3.5 hour release. that is missing, that hasn't been translated. And so it's interesting to be able to try to piece together this story as it's going on. And because of the episodic nature of it, because of the fact that there are moments that connect, tie into one another, but at the same time, it's very episodic in nature. And it's
Mm-hmm.
each moment is a little film that basically creates this larger film about the ambition and the faith that is required to do great acts, and that's something that Rublev loses sight of, both when he's commissioned to do the Last Supper and when he finds himself stuck in the middle of the Tartar invasion. And in the Tartar invasion, he kills somebody, and at that moment, he promises God that he is not going to paint anymore, and he takes a vow of silence. And so he loses sight of what he's supposed to be doing. And it's only the creation of the bell, which is, like I said earlier, was played the bellcaster and the young bellcaster who claims to know the secret of bell casting, is played by the same kid who a few years earlier played Ivan in Ivan's childhood. It's only through witnessing this amazing act of a community coming together, of this arrogant individual who is it's kind of fleecing the prince to say and authority to get this bell made, and he actually doesn't. And the great surprise at the end of it, after you hear it ringing, is he admits to Rublev that he didn't know the secret of bell casting, that it was all an act of hubris on his part, but was one that he was confident that he could do. And
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the great moments the bellcast, basically everything from the introduction of the bellcaster on, is just one of my absolute favorite stretches of film in movie history, and that the ending of that movie just always moves me whenever I see it.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excuse
And
me.
it's a movie that is it's it was made completely in black and white, with the exception of the very ending where you see the actual frescoes and paintings of Rublev at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Uh, and it's largely in black and white. And I've been dying for Criterion to re-release this in Blu-ray, because the DVD Criterion is non-anamorphic, which means
Ah,
on
okay.
my TV it is just a horizontal. It's a rectangular box in the middle of my
Oh, I
TV,
see.
and it is
Yep.
so frustrating to watch. And it's like I need the whole. I mean, yes, you're getting the entire picture, but it's so small on a 55-inch
Yeah.
TV. It's like,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Um,
have it on. I have it on VHS. I have to. I have to watch it again.
yeah, it's interesting, and so yeah, the Criterion is different from the VHS on Rublev, because it is 20 minutes longer, and there's more. I think it was like 40% of the subtitles were actually restored
Oh wow.
from the 3 hour cut to 3 hour 25-minute cut that Criterion put out. But the interesting thing is, it's like, even though Criterion, touted it as, oh, it's the director's cut, the ironic thing is that Tarkovsky actually ended up preferring the shorter cut, which is really interesting. And
That is really interesting.
I haven't seen the 3 hour cut in some time. I don't know that I've ever seen the entire thing the full way through. So I'm curious what was taken out. There's several scenes. One of the most interesting scenes in the movie for me, and it's probably my favorite which is saying something concerning the fact that we talked about Last Temptation of Christ last year.
Mm-hmm.
The depiction of the crucifixion that takes place in Rublev is fascinating. And part of the reason it's fascinating is because it's filmed in Russia in the winter. So you have snow, which obviously you wouldn't necessarily have in Judea. So,
Yeah.
or the Middle East. And so it's really interesting to watch, and everybody's bundled up and stuff like that. It's a very interesting it's a very interesting staging of the crucifixion, not just because of that, but it's just such a haunting version of it.
Yeah.
It's done mostly in wide shot, and it's done over narration of it's done over. Rublev is talking to one of his assistants. They're having a discussion, and that's when this is. So the crucifixion is kind of one of these poetic linkages we've discussed with Tarkovsky before, where it doesn't really have a whole lot to do in terms of the themes of Rublev, but it's also a part that it has a purpose, and it has an emotional purpose, and it has, even if it doesn't have a narrative purpose as well.
Right.
There's a lot of the movie that really that I feel like it's probably the most nakedly religious movie Tarkovsky ever made, and because of the fact that Rublev was a Russian icon painter, and icons were uh, of religious were paintings of religious figures that and religious scenes that makes sense. But it's interesting that you see a lot of pride is very much punished in this movie. You have the other painter, the other monk, the painter Kirill, who you see early on in the movie. He is afforded the chance to work with one of the great painters of the era, Theophanes the Greek, and his arrogance, Kirill's arrogance, gets the better of him when he wants Theophanes to come to the monastery himself and offer to him in front of Rublev, but he actually sends a an assistant who offers the position to Rublev, thus humiliating Kirill. And
Mm-hmm.
that leads Kirill to go out into the secular world to paint. And we see him later at the end of the movie after Rublev has taken his vow of silence back at the monastery. And it's there's so many fascinating. Pride is very important to the thematic structure of the film. You see it in the person in the balloon at the beginning. You see it in Rublev. You see it in Kirill. You see it in the Bellmaker, and you see it's fascinating that there's the one time where pride is really not punished in the movie for one way reason or another's the creation of the bell at the end, and it's one of those, and I it's interesting to think about that the humility is of the bellcaster at the end, the way he breaks down to Rublev. When Rublev confronts him and he tells him the great secret that he's been hiding, that he doesn't know the secret of bellcasting, it's amazing that in that one moment, in that one form of accomplishment, that Tarkovsky does not punish somebody who's extremely prideful. It's the one moment in Rublev that does not happen. And of course,
Right.
it's at the climax, but at the same time, that's part of what makes what happens at the end, the fact that that bell ends up ringing, so suspenseful, and so rewarding when it does.
Mm-hmm.
How many times have you seen Rublev?
I've seen it. I want to say about 3 times. Yeah, about 2, 3 times. Not very many. Um, First time I saw it again, I was in high school, so I didn't really appreciate it as I do now. But yeah, it took me a few viewings to really get into it.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's by far Tarkovsky's longest film. It's almost 3.5 hours or 4
Right.
hours, regardless of how you see it. It's his longest film easily. And it's interesting because of the fact that the structure it does take a couple viewings for the structure to really come into focus when it comes to Rublev.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's his second film, and it's like it's astonishing to me that that's his second film, and it's like it's so gigantic as far as it's so ambitious as a project, and especially coming off of Yvonne's childhood, which is noticeably smaller scale. But I mean,
Right.
there's a lot of big ideas in Yvonne's childhood, but it's smaller scale to this. I mean, the one of the big set pieces is not only the creation of the bell, the casting of the bell, and the ringing of the bell, which you must have been enormous undertaking. But there's also an entire invasion. I mean, it's relatively small scale to what you could do now, but the fact of the matter is, it still feels huge. It still feels like an enormous undertaking for somebody who probably didn't have a tenth of the resources and financial backing that you might give him now. And it's one.
Yeah.
And I mean, they're watching it. It's like it makes me curious. I thought back to I kept thinking about Lawrence of Arabia watching
Right.
Rublev this time around, and because they're both structured unlike what we normally think of when it comes to big epics about big historical figures.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Yeah.
especially with Rublev, it's a 3.5 hour movie about Painter. And the funny thing
Yeah.
is, you never see him paint in the entire movie, even during the
That's
last
true. Yeah.
even when he's supposedly trying to paint the Last Supper, you never actually see him paint.
Yeah.
But he's there are moments where he's a witness to the world as opposed to
Hmm.
the protagonist of this world, and that's one of the things that is so brilliant about what Tarkovsky does in the film, and the fact that throughout the last 45, 50 minutes of the movie, Tarkovsky, you see him, or Rublev, you see him, but he's just watching. He's watching at distance. He's very much like Tarkovsky in that he is watching the world at distance, and
Right.
it's
Right. And he's making his creations from a distance, much like how Tarkovsky does. He expresses himself through his art. You know.
yeah, and he ends up using his art as a reflection of the world
Right.
and
Exactly.
that he
Right.
lives in, and that's one of the ultimate points of Andrei Rublev. But yeah, this I mean, all of Tarkovsky's movies, regardless of whether you're talking about something as seemingly daunting as Stalker or The Sacrifice, or something as straightforward as The Steamroller and the Violin, or Solaris, or something as avant-garde as Rublev or The Mirror. And there's so many things that can be discussed about Tarkovsky, and he's one of he didn't create a lot of films, but the movies he made matter, and there's a reason that they matter because they all come from a personal place. They
Right.
all come from a very particular point of view of the world, and it's one that just really resonated with me when it came to the first time I saw Stalker 20 years ago,
Right.
and like I said, I don't know that was thinking about. I don't know whether Stalker was necessarily my first foreign film. It feels like it was, but it may not have been. But it was my first. It was one of the. It was at a moment where I was really my film love had really come into focus a few years earlier with movies like The Crow and Pulp Fiction and
Yeah.
Ed Wood that I started to discover, and I discovered this whole other aspect of filmmaking beyond Hollywood. and
Yeah.
Tarkovsky's films and Stalker in particular, and really his work in general. Without his work, it would have been, I don't know that I would have been as keen to get into uh, world cinema the way I have, with Bergman, with Kurosawa, with
Hmm.
Fellini, with any of with Truffaut, with any of the filmmakers that I've come to grow and really admire over the years. And Tarkovsky is an important piece of that. And the fact that Stalker and Andrei Rublev still mean as much to me as they do is a great testament to not just the not just the willingness of me as a viewer to give them this chance, but also Tarkovsky's ability to suck me into his world and to really
Right.
resonate with me in a way that really few filmmakers have ever really done.
I agree completely. There are two foreign filmmakers for me that really did that for me when I was really getting into filmmaking, and really appreciate filmmaking more than just as entertainment, but as art. It was, other than some of the great American filmmakers like Scorsese, like Cimino, like Coppola, et cetera. Tarkovsky and Truffaut were always the two for me that I always went back to over and over again. They both had an incredibly amount of heart and humanity, and also beauty in their films that really transfixed me into viewing them. Like you said, much more than most filmmakers are able to do.
Yeah, and I'm finally really starting to dig into Truffaut. Finally, I mean, I had seen 400 Blows long time ago. I had seen Shoot the
Yeah.
Piano Player a long time ago. I had seen Fahrenheit 451, which was my first film of his. Uh,
Hmm.
but I'm really starting to get into the rest of his movies. Jules and Jim I just watched, Stolen Kisses I
Yeah.
just watched, and I'm absolutely head over heels with him. And yeah, I mean it is the personal connection that you feel with Truffaut's work, which is the same personal connection you feel with Tarkovsky's work. It's just
Exactly. Yep.
the only difference is the way they present it and the way they tell
Right.
their stories. Truffaut is very much transfixed with old storytelling techniques, old
Yes.
Hollywood techniques, and being able
Yes.
to tell tell his stories in that way. Tarkovsky is somebody who marched to the beat of his own drummer in very much the same way Kubrick did, but
Right.
with a different emphasis that Kubrick did. I mean, Kubrick was more took a more cynical approach view of humanity, where Tarkovsky really, ultimately, I think he does see the heart of humanity. He does see the spiritual nature of humanity. And he wants to make it. He wants to deepen your horizons, I think, as a filmmaker more than a lot of filmmakers do, and in his own way. And I think he doesn't insist on his worldview, but he invites. But if you're willing to let him in, he's willing to invite you to see things in a different way. And I think that's one of the things I've always appreciated about Tarkovsky.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I've appreciated about him as well, is that he he was never heavy-handed in his approach. It always felt like a gentle. Well, I don't know if gentle is necessarily the right word, but sort of. But like you said, like he invites you into the world rather than pull you into it. He sort of slowly invites you into this world, and
Mm-hmm.
he keeps you in there for as long as you can take it. He he's really good at showing the beauty that surrounds all of us. That sort of makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. No, I no, absolutely, and I think he was a filmmaker where I would, the fact of the matter is, it's like we've got this whole we've got this whole industry of faith based filmmaking that's cropped up in the past 15 of 20 years or so, say, And it would be interesting to see, and most of them are just very generic and very bland looks at faith, and
Yeah,
very predictable. And they're not they basically are saying the same thing over and over. And it's like I would encourage anybody who likes those type of films, and in very much the same way that I would like to invite people of faith to really look with an open mind to Scorsese's Faith trilogy, which we talked about last year. I would
right.
like to see the same thing happen with Tarkovsky, because of the fact that I think ultimately the message and the worldview that Tarkovsky presents, it can be difficult to get into. I get that from the filmmaking standpoint, but from the
Hmm.
emotional standpoint, is absolutely, I think, something that many people with faith could probably relate to.
Oh yeah, for sure. And going back to what you said earlier about how how he's very rarely in in the top 10 directors, and how his movies are very rarely in the top 10 of films of all time, with the exception of Sight and Sound. Um, the reason I bring that up is because, in some weird way, there are not many filmmakers, well, who I know anyway, that even heard of him. It amazes me that I never even heard of him. And I'm like, how can you not? How can you not hear of him? And it's like, you know, and so it's weird. In some way, he's known, but then in another sense, there's a sort of quiet side of not many that do know him. And I think that also too reflects in his filmmaking. His filmmaking is very quiet in the sense that meditative, reflective, and it takes a lot to get into from a filmmaker standpoint, like we're talking about here. And that almost in a way reflects on his legacy.
Well, and it's funny because it's funny that you mentioned that you know a lot of filmmakers that hadn't really heard of him. It's funny because when I started to get to know filmmakers like yourself and some of the other ones that I've gotten to know over the years, I've found that he's arguably a little more known from younger filmmakers such as yourself than
That's interesting.
I actually expected.
Yeah.
And because for a long time, because of the fact that even my friends never really had heard of them, they weren't really into foreign films as much as I did, except for my one friend Jeff, who I mentioned, who loves The Mirror, loves Solaris, but had a hard time getting
Yep.
into Stalker. He's big into foreign films though, and so it's not really surprising that he would resonate with that Tarkovsky would resonate with him, and
Hmm.
he's interested in a very particular type of film, so that doesn't surprise me. But yeah, it's like it's weird. I mean, not just you, but there are a couple of other filmmakers that I've come to know that are like, yeah, I mean, Tarkovsky is somebody that they had heard of, and it's not a lot of filmmakers, but it's more than I expected. And so it's like,
Yeah.
okay, that actually, and you can, once you start to know that, it's like you start to see that influence in their work, and you start to see that it's like, okay, I can see that, I can see that,
Right.
yeah, it makes sense that they
Hmm.
do. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, and so yeah, but for a while, I did kind of feel like I was on my own little island when it comes to Tarkovsky. Now
Oh, I did too.
nobody had
Yeah.
really heard of him, and I think the sad thing is it. I think part of the reason is, I'm sure part of the reason might have had to do with, he's a very difficult filmmaker to get into. I will
Yes.
fully admit that. And if all you know is Hollywood filmmaking, that's going to be inevitable that you're not really into his work. I kind of get that. Or hadn't
Yeah.
even really heard of his work. But the sad thing is, I also kind of wonder how much of when he was making films, because he was a Russian filmmaker in the middle of the Cold War. And because of the tensions with between America and the Soviet Union at that time, you do kind of wonder whether if whether if things had been different for him in terms of the way his films were released, the way those relations were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, whether he might have had more of a reach and to where maybe he would have been an obviously well-regarded filmmaker in the same way we view Kurosawa or Truffaut or Bergman now.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the things that you kind of wonder too, because the 24 years that his career spanned from 1962 when he made Ivan's Childhood, or when it was released at 86 when The Sacrifice came out. I mean, we were still in, the Cold War. By the time he was ironically making movies outside of Russia, was coming to an end. But at the same time, I mean, there's the fact that he's a Russian filmmaker, and I think sort of a lot of people might be expecting something different from him than what you are going to get. And I think that's
right.
And that's one of the things I like about him is the fact that it's like he's not a filmmaker who obviously who obviously is telling the type of stories that you would necessarily expect a Russian filmmaker to make during those times.
Right.
But yeah, with all that being said, this is probably a pretty good time to wrap up. I mean, we there's a lot of ground to cover. I mean, we talked about 3 films when it comes to Scorsese. We're talking about 8 films when it comes to Tarkovsky, and there's a lot to talk about with all of those films. But I'm really glad we were able to do this. This is definitely a lot of fun.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, I always enjoy getting into when we do get into film discussions on Facebook. I always enjoy that, and I know I kind of perked up the first time I kind of got the impression that you were a Tarkovsky fan on there. It's like, ooh, okay, he's all right. There's another Tarkovsky fan.
There's another one, yeah.
Talk about, yeah. But thank you very much for doing this, and thank you very much for sharing your insights on Tarkovsky. And it was definitely I'm always kind of interested in how people. One of the things that I'm really wanting to focus on with the podcast this year is less about me, how I view films, and more about bringing other people into how they view films and how they view specific filmmakers. And so,
right.
I mean, this is definitely something I want to continue, not just with you, but with other people as well. So thank you very much for doing this with me.
No, thank you for inviting me. This was great. It's great to see, like you said, somebody else that knows about Tarkovsky and not only can talk about him, but can talk about him in great length. I don't know many that can. So this was, and at the same time, I learned new things about him that I never knew. So so this was great.
Yeah, and if anybody listening to this is interested, 4 of Tarkovsky's movies are part of the Criterion Collection: Andrei Rublev, Ivan's Childhood, Solars, and Stalker. You can find the other films he made: The Sacrifice, Nostalgia, The Mirror, and Seymour Learned the Violin on Amazon, I believe. I think actually I got all of those through Amazon over the years. And if you can find a not expensive version of his copy of his book, Sculpting in Time, if you're a Tarkovsky fan, it's highly recommended. If not, I definitely would check out when you watch The Sacrifice. Definitely watch the documentary directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. It gives you a lot about him as an individual and him with his process as a filmmaker. But thank you very much to Chris Esper for joining me tonight. I definitely, now I need to, now I want to figure out another filmmaker to tackle.
Filmmaker, yeah.
Films to
Yeah,
just
yeah.
because this is always fun. So, and being able
There it goes
to,
to it goes to Truffaut next.
yeah, I mean, Truffaut would actually be a very good example, because, yeah, I mean, I've I've gotten more into his, I've gotten more into his films over the past year. He was my bookend filmmaker for Movie a Week this past year, so
Yeah, yeah.
he's definitely somebody who's officially on my radar, and he's definitely somebody
Hmm.
that whose work I really love. So
Yeah,
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 that may
yeah,
very well be the next one is
yeah.
Truffaut, and I
I
would
was
be
gonna, I was gonna,
perfectly fine
I
with
was
that.
gonna. Yeah, it's also. I was gonna say you have to see Day for Night next. That one's probably my favorite of his.
I think for Truffaut, I think that is my next one. Actually,
Oh,
well,
okay, cool. Yeah,
maybe not, but it's definitely one that I want to see next.
yeah.
It's definitely one that's going to be seen at some point. Maybe in the next. I might bump it up there in the next year. So,
Nice.
but thank you very much, Chris,
Thank you.
for doing this. This was a lot of fun, and
Oh, good.
I'm going to sign off right quick and make sure we got everything, and we'll wrap this up. Just a minute.
All right.
I'd like to thank Chris Esper for joining me this evening. It was really wonderful being able to talk about Andrei Tarkovsky with him. I've been looking forward to that podcast for a long time, and I definitely look forward to more discussions of more filmmakers with him as we go along. We're already in talks of probably doing one on Francois Truffaut, who we mentioned on the podcast this evening, and that should be an entertaining one as well. Check us out again on Sonic Cinema Patreon. Chris is actually a patron, so I definitely hope to get some people to join him. I've got a lot of great things lined up for bonuses for people who pledge to the podcast, and thank you for joining us. And this is Brian Scuttle for the Sonic Cinema podcast, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you.